Kevin McGuffey joining us from Last Word on College Football to talk up the Cats with the early signing period upon us, and 20 of 21 that are expected to sign already on the dotted line for Kentucky football as the Cats and Mark Stoops approach a Music City Bowl date on December 29th against Northwestern, a 9-3 team out of the Big Ten. Kevin, in regards to Kentucky's final few games, the entirety of the season, and going 7-5, 4-4 in the SEC, but maybe not concluding 2017 as you would have liked. Your thoughts about the Cats' mindset and the performance of the team coming down the stretch as they head toward a date with Northwestern?
You know, unfortunately, is another kind of swoon at the end of the season, for lack of a better term. You know, Cats started 7-1, finished 9-5, or excuse me, 7-5, 9-5. We wouldn't be as disappointed up here as you know, you go back to the Florida game, that, you know, a game that they had and they blew it. You know, the game against Ole Miss where they basically had nothing to play for, but, you know, Jordan Ta'amu, you know, turned into Tom Brady. Of course, he turned out to be a pretty good player the rest of the year anyway. But, you know, those are two games that, you know, fans look at and just, you know, they should have won those games. And had they won them, they would be playing probably, you know, in the Outback Bowl on New Year's Day. But as you said, you know, you had the bad loss to Mississippi State. You know, they beat Vanderbilt handily, but then you finish the season. You know, you and I talked after the Georgia game. You know, they played Georgia good for 2.5 quarters, but still ended up losing by, you know, 29. And then the Louisville game was just honestly just a total debacle. You know, Lamar Jackson basically got his payback from 2016. You know, there was just all kinds of, you know, there was penalties, there was unsportsmanlike conduct. You know, Jordan Jones. You know, we were talking before we went on the air here. You know, Jordan Jones and Lamar Jackson got into it on the sidelines, and then, you know, Denzel Ware picks up a garbage can and throws it at a U of L player. I mean, it was just bad all around, and it's kind of left a bad taste in a lot of the fans', you know, mouth here. And honestly, like I said, I think this, you know, the new early signing period was probably the best thing that could have happened with Kentucky right now, because now everybody, you know, has kind of forgotten about the Louisville game, forgotten about all of that, and is like, you know, kind of gotten excited about next year. But, you know, you still have this game, you know, you still have this game to play. And I think it's kind of an uphill battle against Northwestern, because honestly, I think Northwestern, you know, I think maybe it's because of the fact that Ohio State and Wisconsin, neither one made the bowl championship, you know, the playoff, that, you know, Northwestern is playing in a little lower tier game than probably what they should have been. But, you know, you got to play the games, and it should be a very interesting game. You got two teams, you know, you got two great running backs, Justin Jackson, you got Benny Snell for Kentucky. I look for, you know, lots of rushing, you know, lots of running the ball. And then on the flip side of the ball, you have, you know, the two worst pass defenses. You know, Northwestern was last in the Big Ten in pass defense, and Kentucky was last in the SEC. So, you know, you have Northwestern's quarterback, who I know they just announced today he's coming back to school next year. So, and then this will be Steven Johnson's last game. I think that's going to be one of the more interesting keys to the game, is who's, you know, which team can throw the ball better. You know, and I think whoever does that will probably stand a really good chance of winning.
The bowl slotting. So you bring up an interesting point right there, because the Big Ten and the SEC have long taken a disadvantage when it comes to bowl slotting, because they go to national championship games more so than the other conferences, and also put more teams into what was at one point the BCS round, the BCS championship series of bowl games, than the other conferences, and now is the New Year's Six. So, for example, last year the Big Ten put Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, and somebody else that I'm forgetting, Penn State, into New Year's Six bowl games. So they take 4 teams, and you got to go to the 5th place team in the Big Ten before they're playing an outside New Year's Six game. And that happens to the SEC on a regular basis as well. But as you mentioned, with the Big Ten not making the college football playoff, the slotted down a little bit more. Northwestern got snubbed by a couple bowls, and here they land as a 9-3 team, ranked in the top 25 against a 7-5 team. And Kentucky then went at 4-4 in the SEC. it's alarming to me on the Northwestern side that they finished last in the Big Ten in pass defense, because the first thing that comes to mind is that they play in the Western Division. And I don't see a whole lot of teams doing a great job of throwing the football in the Western Division. When you talk about Minnesota's awful throwing the ball, Illinois on that side, Purdue actually can throw it around a little bit and had a pretty good passing game with Jeff Brom in his first season and getting them to a bowl game for the first time in 5 years. Nebraska was bad, but Tanner Lee actually put up big numbers because they were constantly behind. And Iowa, aside from that Ohio State aberration, had their issues with Nathan Stanley at quarterback. So I don't know who's giving up all these yardage. What teams are racking up yardage against in Northwestern? They had a big out-of-conference loss against Duke early in the season, and they had to take on Penn State. Off the top of my head, was the best team that they played in the Eastern Division. They also lost to Michigan State, or actually beat Michigan State, but gave up a ton of yardage and giving up like 60 pass attempts against Brian Lewerke of Michigan State. So maybe Kentucky does take advantage. On the flip side, Northwestern, even though they're known for running the ball, as you mentioned, Clayton Thorson, a capable quarterback. You really can't go by the numbers, with 15 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, victimized by a bad offensive line and not bad receivers. They've got a 4 and 5 deep at wide receiver that are decent, but nobody's going to take the top off a defense. And that's something you don't worry about when you're playing Northwestern. Probably not going to get hit with the tremendous athlete on the perimeter that's going to burn a defense. So it will be an intriguing matchup with these two teams getting together.
With the bowl slotting, everything leading up to the Music City Bowl, we had heard, going into that Louisville game, I think you and I even talked that, if Kentucky lost, they would probably end up in the Liberty Bowl, which, ended up not taking an SEC team at all, which I thought was odd, because now you have like Memphis playing, basically a home game. But, all the talk had been it was going to be either Iowa or Purdue. And I think, that would have been a more sensible matchup. But as you said, like, Steven Johnson, maybe this rest is going to be good. Just, talking about the passing game, he's been nursing a sore shoulder for like the last, 4 or 5 weeks of the season. Like the last 2 or 3 games, Kentucky pretty much almost became exclusively a running team, with Benny Snell, who put up some incredible numbers those last, 4 or 5 weeks of the season. If Kentucky can get, I think, Kentucky's best chance, if they can get that, they've had trouble with the deep pass, all year. They lost Jeff Badet, who transferred to Oklahoma. He was their best deep threat. You have Garrett Johnson, you have Taven Richardson, you have, Lynn Bowden. Any of those guys, if Kentucky can establish any kind of passing game, I think, that's their best chance to win. As you said, it does make you wonder, because the Big Ten West is not that good, how, Northwestern is getting lit up for all those, for all those yards. So, as a Kentucky fan, it's got, you got a good, that gives you a good feeling. If Kentucky can throw the ball and throw the ball well, then they have a good chance of winning.
Yeah, the Big Ten Western Division isn't just marginal; it's the style of play, as you mentioned. When you know that Minnesota's, if you look at their passing stats, they're abysmal, and other teams, even Wisconsin being a top 10 team in the country, well, they don't get to that place throwing the ball. They throw it 18 or 20 times a game, and I mean consistently 18 or 20 times a game. So Northwestern found some ways on defense to give up passing yards, but still only lost 3 games on the season. Another place where Kentucky might have an advantage. Again, I think Northwestern has serious issues along the offensive line. Justin Jackson has been one of the best kept secrets in college football. When you talk about periphery fans who don't look at maybe some of the somewhat lesser programs and just look at the elite teams, because Justin Jackson actually has finished in the top 10 in Big Ten history in rushing. He's been a 1,600 yard back his entire career, and actually had his worst season this year, only averaging 4.5 yards per carry. And if you look at rushing numbers across college football, teams as good as Northwestern that finish in the top 25 in the country, they have running backs running for 6.5 yards. That's a regular number in college football, and he's at 4.5, and he's a really good back. And it was a struggle for him to gain 1,154 yards this season. I will say, Kevin, one last note on the Northwestern offense. They're not going to burn you on the perimeter, but Garrett Dickerson only caught 38 balls and 4 touchdowns. But if Northwestern is smart, I've seen them play quite a bit this year. They want to get him the football. He's a pro prospect and could give Kentucky some issues in the secondary.
Oh yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, I think that's probably Northwestern's. Like I said, Kentucky's secondary has been suspect. It was supposed to be a strength this year and has been anything but. And it would not surprise me to see them, maybe even come out and try some deep balls, throw, because a lot of people had success throwing deep against Kentucky. Like I said, I would, unless something changes, I would expect him to probably have a pretty big game.
I don't want to rely strictly on statistics because they can lie. They can make liars out of all of us. But typically, when you look at the offensive and defensive ranks, not even going into the deep metrics, the extended metrics that are so commonplace right now in college football, but just the standard yards per game for the offense and the defense. Kentucky, for a team that finished 7-5, that won half its games in the SEC, was outside of the top 70 in the FBS in both offense and defense. So that either speaks to being lucky, which after 12 games, I don't think it does. So I'm just kidding there. I think it speaks to playing situational football. They must have been good in the red zone, both offensively and defensively, and taking advantage of the turnover ratio and turning those turnovers into points and maybe being put in a bad position by the offense at times and the defense bailing out the offense. But the standard metrics would speak to this being a very average football team, but they eked out wins where maybe a lot of teams didn't.
Yeah, I mean, in Kentucky's, luck, luck did play a little bit of a role in, Kentucky's season this year. They had, 4 or 5 games that came down to the last, to the last play. The East going back, early in the season, Eastern Michigan, they intercepted a pass on the 5-yard line on the last play, to preserve a 24-20 win. Missouri, Drew Lock, last play of the game, incomplete pass, had a chance to win the game. Of course, that was the last game that Missouri lost. They, got on this incredible streak that they're on right now. Even the Tennessee game, the Kentucky won the Tennessee game, but, they scored with a couple minutes left. But then Tennessee, they let, Tennessee convert a 4th and 26 or 4th and 20 something, and then, got the ball to midfield again, in the last play of the game. They actually completed, a Hail Mary, but thankfully, Derek Beatty, tackled the Tennessee receiver at the 3-yard line, or Kentucky, would have lost that game. So, there's been a lot of things like that have happened, and then of course in the Florida and Ole Miss games, they went the other way. But, like I said, I did a thing at Last Word in College Football talking about 5 plays that shaped Kentucky's season. And that was, a lot of those plays right there, the play against Florida where, twice they had 10 guys on the field that led to, Florida touchdowns. That was, if Kentucky was going to beat Florida, this was the year, and you look at, they're recruiting today, Dan Mullen, they loaded up, they're going to be, I think, pretty good going forward. This was Kentucky's year. I don't want to get on that tangent again, but no, like I said, Kentucky has been good in the red zone, and they've been fairly good on defense in the red zone as well. They've just been giving up a lot of big plays. So eliminate the big plays. I still think they got to try to make Northwestern beat them with the pass, but I think it's going to be a close. I think it's like a 7 or 8 point spread. I think it's going to be less than a touchdown. I think it's going to be closer than people think.
That's too high. That is too high. Northwestern, I give them all the credit in the world, because what's intriguing about this particular matchup, but really any Northwestern bowl game, is that if you just lined up these guys and had them run 40 times, and then if you took them out there and had them jump verticals and then also bench press, I guarantee Kentucky would win a contest. And they've brought in top 25 recruiting classes. Northwestern's recruiting classes are typically in the 50s, but they somehow win games. And if you look at the better teams that they played this year, okay, by far the 2 best teams that they played, Wisconsin and Penn State. Penn State blew them out 31-7. Wisconsin, it's a 33-24 game, but believe me, I watched that game almost gun to gun, and Wisconsin dominated that game. Northwestern made a couple plays in the 4th quarter to get close and give them a little bit of a scare late in that game. So they get manhandled typically by superior teams, but to their credit, they beat everybody they're supposed to beat. And if anybody's close in talent, they usually beat them. Now down the stretch, Michigan State was an impressive win. Iowa's a really good football team. I know they only went 7-5, but Iowa's pretty good. And they won that game 17-10. And then the game of the year for them, again, Michigan State being one of the 15 best teams in the country. I think generally that would be the consensus. They took on Michigan State. They took them to 3 overtimes. They win that game 39-31, throwing the ball all over the place. And then they beat all the bad teams in the Big Ten. And they didn't always bludgeon them. They just do what they need to do to win. And if you look back, Kevin, a couple of years, Northwestern had a very similar team, came into a bowl game against Tennessee. This was just a couple of years ago, actually at 10-2 and ranked in the top 12 or 13 in the country. And if they don't play their game, and if they're just a little bit off and not playing their A game fundamentally, Tennessee's athletes just wiped them off the field.
Yeah, no, I remember that game very, very well, thinking that, Tennessee would have a lot of trouble in that game. And as you said, they just blew them, they just blew them out. So I just say Kentucky probably has the better athletes. I think, maybe this month has, gotten some guys healthy, mainly, Steven Johnson. Because like I said, the last few weeks of the season, he's really struggled. And I think it's, more, he won't admit, it was like a shoulder injury, but I think it's what the case is. But as you said, of course, you talked about Iowa. Iowa was the the talk of the when the playoff was announced. It was because Ohio State didn't make it because they got blown out by Iowa. And this is a team. And then you turn around and say, okay, well, this is a team that Northwestern beat. So it's like, well, okay,
And they beat Michigan State.
Yeah, maybe these guys, they're coming in on a 7-game winning streak. So the old saying, anything can happen any given week, right?
And then just here in the last 5 years with very similar talent, again, when we talk Northwestern, I know I'm not talking about the same exact players going back 5 years, but very similar type players. Took out a Mississippi State team that had won 9 games in the Gator Bowl. They won that game. And then, the Outback Bowl against Tennessee was a debacle, 45-6. Last year, they were a full touchdown underdog against a Pitt team that beat Penn State and Clemson. They go up against Pitt that had James Conner and some other NFL quality players, and they beat them 31-24 in the Pinstripe Bowl. So they can't be discarded in any possible way, but they are limited in some athletic areas on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think another thing that's going to help Kentucky is they went to a bowl game last year, because Kentucky had not been since after the 2010 season. And, if you watch that Tax Slayer Bowl game against Georgia Tech, Kentucky just looked happy to, the first half, I won't say they were scared, but they were, they were tentative. Steven Johnson fumbled right out of the gate. Georgia Tech led to a Georgia Tech touchdown. In the second half, they played a whole lot better. But I think now the fact that they've went to a bowl game last year and they're going to another one this year, and I also think, even though due to, great scheduling by CBS, the Kentucky-Louisville basketball game, is at 1 o'clock on, next Friday, and the ball game is at 4:30. They're expecting, thousands upon thousands of, UK fans, to come down I-65, into Nashville, and they're going to try to make basically a big party atmosphere down there. I think Kentucky will have the home field advantage. Kentucky, does have the better athletes, but it's just, but as you said, Northwestern seems to be, when it comes to a bowl game, they seem to be able to, no matter, with the exception of like the Tennessee game a couple years ago, they seem to be able to get the job done. So.
All right, it's Northwestern and Kentucky as the Big Ten and the SEC. Typical rivals during the postseason, but only getting together a couple matchups this particular postseason, and this is one of them, Northwestern and Kentucky at the Music City Bowl. That game on December 29th, and the Wildcats trying to close out 2017 with a bowl win, as opposed to the game Kevin alludes to against Georgia Tech and losing to Yellow Jackets last year to finish at 7-6. Kevin McGuffey from Last Word on College Football helping us sort out Kentucky football with postseason play up ahead, but also recruiting and 20 signees on the early signing day. Kevin, we appreciate you breaking things down for us.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me on. It's always a lot of fun. I really appreciate you having me on.